Hi, everyone. Welcome so much for joining us today to our webinar series called Science at the Edge. This is brought to you by the Institute for Science and Policy here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I'll be your host for today. I'm Kristen Uhlenbrock, and I work for the Institute. In this series we've been hosting, we've been exploring these new ideas and innovations happening in science and technology through the lens of how it is influencing society. Hence the title, Science at the Edge. If you've missed any of our previous two recordings, we covered some really fascinating topics. We talked about generative AI, and then we also talked about carbon capture technology. And then today, which many of you obviously are tuning into, is another really fascinating topic that we're going to be discussing, which is ideas in reducing polarization. So many of you are quite aware that we are approaching a pretty big national election cycle here coming up. And I really was interested in exploring the idea of what does polarization mean here in 2023 as we head into this election cycle. Are we really more divided as a society? Where are we divided when we talk about division and politics? Where maybe we don't quite get it right as a society and we kind of have it more as a perception about the division than what is based in reality. So I'm really excited to kind of unpack some of these questions and conversation that we'll have. We have an amazing lineup of guests today who are really going to be very deliberate and transparent and open to discussing some of the roots of our divisiveness, as well as some effective ways that we've seen in bridging divides or intervention measures. Because a lot of this comes back to how we want to strengthen our democracy. And I'll have to say the root of this conversation is very much at the heart of what the Institute for Science and Policy does. It is about bridging those divides and having really thoughtful conversations. So I'm really excited for our three guests who are joining us today. Let me do a brief introduction for them and we'll kind of get started. We have Laura Frank. Laura is the Executive Director for the Colorado News Collaborative. She's a dear partner of ours at the Institute. Laura's been a longtime investigative reporter and journalist who has really pioneered collaborative journalism in Colorado, originally with being the founder of an organization called the iNews, which was a nonprofit investigative news organization that merged with Rocky Mountain Public Media. And now she runs this big news collaborative and works with the Colorado Media Project and many others. It's great to see you. How are you doing today, Laura?
Oh, thanks. It's great to be here. I'm excited for this conversation. Thanks for gathering us, Kristen.
Thanks for being here. And two other colleagues that we have joining us. We have Stephen Hawkins. He's a director of research for More in Common, which is an international organization where he definitely oversees the studies of the psychology of political division throughout 9 countries. He's been with the organization since its inception and founding in 2016. And I first came to learn more about the organization More in Common through a project that he led called Hidden Tribes, which is really fascinating. We'll probably learn a little bit about that today as well. And Stephen is actually located here in Denver, Colorado, technically full-time, although he is not today. He is joining us from Madrid, Spain. Hi, Stephen. Thanks for being up so late to join us. How are you doing?
Hi, Kristen. I'm doing great. I'm really glad to be here.
Awesome. Great. And our third guest is Jan Voekel. And Jan's going to correct me, even though I have a German last name. I definitely did not say his correctly. Jan is a researcher at the Polarization and Social Change Lab at Stanford University, where he's finishing his PhD in sociology. His research focuses on developing psychological strategies for social change towards less divisive and more equal societies. And he's got a number of focus areas, including a little bit on American political polarization and democracy. And I came to learn about some of Jan's work through him being the lead organizer for an effort called Strengthening Democracy Challenge that we'll also learn a little bit about today. Jan, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I very much look forward to discussing with all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Just a little quick housekeeping item for those of you who joined us today. You probably heard Nicole say if you joined us, we've got a chat feature. Go ahead and open that up. We're happy to take your questions in that chat, and we'll try to work them into our conversation as we go along. So definitely chime in. Hopefully we'll cover a lot of those topics, but this is a pretty big topic, so we probably won't get to everything that you all ask, but we'll do our best. And my apologies in advance if we don't get to your specific question, but we love to see them. Okay, so let me do a little stage setting and actually have my guest today share a little bit more about the organization or the work that they do, because I do think it's quite relevant and fascinating what some of them are doing. So why don't we just kind of go around and we'll kind of do this sequentially. Why don't I start with how I introduced you? So we'll go Laura, Stephen, and then Jan. So why don't you just take a couple minutes each and give our guest a little bit about what you do?
Sure, happy to. So CoLab, the Colorado News Collaborative, is a relatively new nonprofit, 501c3 nonprofit. It was born at the same time the pandemic started, because that's always a good time to start a new nonprofit at the beginning of a global pandemic. But the intent for CoLab is to help strengthen journalism and thus strengthen democracy in communities throughout Colorado. And we work with more than 180 news organizations of all stripes, all through the state. If you can think of the news organization, it probably has been involved in CoLab at some level. And we do three things that we shorthand as reporting, reach, and revenue. We know that having really high quality, in-depth reporting helps democracy on many levels. If you lose reporting, which we've seen multiple times here in Colorado and across the country, then we know fewer people run for office, fewer people vote, and polarization increases. And my colleagues on this call can probably cite some of the very specific research about that. It's quite strong and quite clear. So CoLab is trying to strengthen journalism organizations, not only by helping them do collaborative, large, in-depth reporting projects that most newsrooms could not do alone. We're also helping them connect with community, be that conduit, that connector in community, that convener of community. And we're helping them grow their businesses to be more sustainable so they can do more of that community engagement and in-depth reporting. So that's how we started. It was a group of community and journalism leaders coming together in 2020, and it's grown from 0 to 180 news organizations and hundreds of members of the public, more than 1,000 people supporting us financially as a nonprofit. So we know that we've hit upon something that people wanted, and that it seems to be having some positive impact. So we're thrilled by that.
Awesome.
Very impressive. Thanks for the explanation. That's a lot of very quick growth. I work for More in Common. More in Common was born in tragedy. In 2016, there was a British member of parliament named Joe Cox, who was a big supporter of helping refugees resettle into the United Kingdom, refugees from Syria and from the Middle East. And it was that support that cost her her life. One of her constituents attacked her when she was out with staffers, and she was killed for her beliefs. And the name More in Common comes from her first speech in Parliament, where she talked about the commonality that her constituents had, despite being a very diverse constituency. And so our mission since 2016 has been to help explain what the roots of division are in these societies that have become more polarized. And since 2016, we've grown. So we are active today in the UK, France, Germany, Poland, and the United States. Today, we're about 50 staff. We've released over 100 reports. We get about 400 media mentions or have articles written about our work per year across those countries. And we work with political parties, we work with governments, we work with nonprofits and philanthropic groups, and with the business sector as well. And the main thing that we're trying to do is, I'm hesitating here because I don't know if I'm still frozen.
You're good from our side.
Okay. What we're trying to do is explain the psychology of the different groups in society and how we're divided. Oftentimes in societies, divisions fall along ethnic lines or along regional lines, as they did in the United States for so many decades. But today, what we see in the West, and including in the United States, is that many of the divisions that we see fall along cultural lines or are represent differences in values and differences in ideology. And those things are difficult to categorize. They don't map cleanly onto race or generation or region. And so you need to create new categories that capture where people fall within this landscape of division of cultures. And so that's what we do primarily is we create our own categories to describe the map of division. That's the Hidden Tribes study that Kristen alluded to in 2018. And we've released reports like that in each of the countries that we work in. And we use our academic experts, of which we have 8 people with PhDs on our team currently, to help inform and shape our research so that we can make our understanding of the psychology of division relevant to debates that come up, whether it's about climate change, about COVID, about economic policy, about critical race theory, any of the major topics of our time, so we can better understand what are the true lines of division in society, how big are the gaps between us and our perspectives, and crucially, what can we do to overcome them? Where is there common ground? What language can we use to bring people together? And how can organizations with large reach, such as governments or media channels, what can they do to help work in a way that brings people together rather than exacerbating divisions?
Yeah, fascinating. I am, as Kristen has introduced me, a researcher. So one thing that is fascinating from my perspective is that, like, when we do our research, we very much believing in accumulating knowledge over time. And like some of the problems that we study, however, can feel so urgent that there is a strong desire to accelerate that that progress. And throughout my PhD, I very much felt that a lot of people were working on the same problem, but all were doing it a little bit isolated from each other. And so what we did with the Strengthening Democracy Challenge was that we tried to really form a collaboration that formed across different scientific disciplines, as well as trying to bring people from outside of academia into that as well, and then try to use rigorous scientific methods in order to really isolate causal factors that can result in reductions in some of the division that we are seeing. So, like, together with my wonderful collaborators, like from the main team of the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, but also with researchers from across the world, from political science, sociology, psychology, communication scholars, economists, as well as practitioners who work in bridging organizations. We try to bring the best ideas together and then to test them as rigorously as possible to try to identify what are the strongest psychological mechanisms that can cause change in affective polarization as well as democratic attitudes. And that is what I'm trying to bring to the table today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jan, let me come right back to you because you just used this word that I want to level set with our audience, which is affective polarization. So would you do a little bit of defining of that for us?
Yeah, I would love to. So, like, often people just use the term polarization or political polarization, and it's often like not super clear what that really means because it can have different meanings. So let me just introduce 2 different dimensions here, right? So like one is that polarization in general means that there are 2 poles that are pretty far away from each other, and there's also an implicit meaning of a time trend that like groups are moving towards these poles, so they're moving further away from each other. And that can refer to disagreements on political issues, such as gun rights, abortion, immigration, right? You could imagine that like Republicans and Democrats, for example, may drift further apart on these issues, with both becoming more extreme. However, that's not really the case. within the American public, there's not strong support for consistent, what we call attitudinal polarization in the mass public. However, in contrast, there is more evidence for what we call effective polarization, which describes how much supporters of the different sides dislike each other. And there we see over the last few decades that Democrats and Republicans felt like pretty neutral towards each other like 30 or 40 years ago. But since then, that dislike has really grown. And so it's fascinating that, like, while over time we haven't really grown further apart on political attitudes, maybe we have become a bit more consistent in terms of that, like, people with a liberal ideology hold more consistently liberal attitudes, people with a conservative ideology hold a bit more consistent conservative ideology, but we haven't really become much more extreme when it comes to political attitudes. But still, we have started to really dislike the other side. And so that is like how I would distinguish affective polarization from attitudinal polarization.
Stephen, do you want to add into that?
I think that captures it really well. I mean, just to quantify it a little bit, we use these thermometer scales, 0 to 100, where 100 means I love you, you're my partner. 0 means you're the worst dictator ever, you're my enemy. And to Jan's point about neutrality, in the 1980s during the Reagan era, Republicans and Democrats rated each other at about 45, which is very just subtly below 50, which would be completely neutral. And I think this is my own opinion, but that's a pretty good place for democracy to be, where people say, well, I don't actively dislike you, but I do disagree with you. And so there's just a little bit there that makes me feel less than neutral towards you. And now we're down into the 20s. So we've dropped about 20 points or more in the last 30 years. And so that's the baseline that we're now working with when Republicans and Democrats think about each other. I will say that a lot of our research has found that people work with caricatures when it comes to Republicans and Democrats. And there's academic literature in especially the field of political science that talks about false polarization, another relevant term. And what that refers to is disagreeing with a group of people when in reality you're projecting an opinion or a quality onto that group that they don't possess to the same degree that you think they do. So you're exaggerating or caricaturing them. And so some kind of almost laughable examples of this, or if you ask Republicans what percent of Democrats are LGBTQ, they'll guess 45%. Or if you ask Democrats what percent of Republicans are millionaires, they'll guess 20 or 30%, when in reality, those are very small percentages of those groups. And then if you ask people to make estimates about the degree of difference on specific issues, as Jan alluded to before, often Republicans and Democrats will vastly overestimate the degree of ideological difference that they have with the other side. And so I think this is part of what you were queuing up for us, Kristen, to talk about, is the degree to which this is a real phenomenon versus an imagined or pretend phenomenon. And it's both at the same time, because the emotional frustration and angst and dislike is very real and measurable, and we've quantified that, while the differences between the parties are actually not as massive as people tend to imagine.
These, I admitted earlier that I am a journalist who loves numbers, so I'm really fascinated by the breakdown of this. And I know we have both Stanford and Harvard represented on this panel, which I'm going to bring Yale, if that's okay, into it. I'm not a graduate of Yale, but I'm going to bring some data from Yale. You might be familiar with their 6 Americas survey, looking at ideologically positioned people. And there's one group that they call dismissives, which I think is when we worry about polarization, we're really worried about those people who just cannot tolerate thinking about what the other side does or believes or what have you. But in the Yale survey, the 6 Americas survey, they found that the majority of people, about 70% of Americans, are in this middle. and that they generally are concerned, and Kristen, you'll appreciate this, about science-based issues. They may not be fully alarmed about them. They may not be, ready to buy an electric car, whatever the action might be, but they are concerned about science-based issues, and they're increasingly, and this is where I put my hope, polarization fatigued. And maybe the folks who are joining us on this call today can relate to that polarization fatigue. They are just tired of the vitriol that is going back and forth. And so a lot of folks are talking now about, well, how do we speak to that 70% of the middles? How do we speak to them? And how do we make sure they get the kind of information that is not polarizing, because we know some information is polarizing, the way it's presented, the kind of information that it is polarizing. How do we make sure we avoid that and capitalize on that majority of Americans who do care about facts and don't necessarily see each other as the enemy, before we keep sliding down the slippery slope that Stephen and Jan are describing from the data that is growing? Not only do I disagree with you, I actually hate you.
Yeah. In 2018, Laura, we, in that Hidden Tribes report that Kristen alluded to, we described a group we called the exhausted majority, and we defined it as 2/3 of Americans, almost exactly the same as the Yale group, 67% or 70%. And it's not a homogenous group. You have Democrats, independents, non-voters, Republicans in that group, but they feel fed up by division. They're more ideologically flexible. If you know how they think about one issue, it doesn't necessarily mean you can predict how they think about everything else. And they're more supportive of politicians finding compromise and leaders finding compromise rather than standing their ground. And we've seen that term really took on a life of its own. And since then, we've seen figures like Andrew Yang, who ran for president, using that term. We saw a senator, Democratic Senate candidate in Ohio, Tim Ryan, running on speaking to the exhausted majority. And today, the leader of the National Governors Association, the group that convenes the 50 governors in the United States, is led by or chaired by the Utah governor, Spencer Cox. And he is really committed to speaking to the exhausted majority and refers to it in all of his public events as part of his broader efforts to reduce polarization through his leadership. And so we share that ambition. How do you talk to the exhausted majority? Because while we see it as a social phenomenon, and I give talks around the country, talk to all different audiences, and it really resonates with people. People easily self-describe as belonging to the exhausted majority. You can see that fatigue in the way that people speak about the country. The problem is we haven't been able to see it manifest itself in an electoral reality. Tim Ryan lost that race. Andrew Yang didn't get nominated. And while we're talking about exhaustion and the need to move on into a place of greater healing as a country, we're seeing that the last presidential race is looking like it's going to also be the next presidential race. And so we're seeing that the incentives of politics don't necessarily align to reflect the reality of what the population wants in the United States. And part of that may be very much because we have this two-party system. I'm speaking from Madrid, and my colleagues here in Europe have different options. They have center-left, center-right parties, far-right parties, centrist parties. And in the United States, because of this affective polarization, where there's almost nothing worse than imagining the other political party taking power for most people, they will opt for more divisive characters oftentimes, despite the fact that they might want a leadership that doesn't reflect that sort of partisan and ideological positioning.
Yeah, like this disconnect between the preferences of the public and the actual leaders that are in Congress, I find it really fascinating, and I think it's also indicative of two trends that we see there, like the pattern that I talked about earlier with regard to attitudinal polarization in the mass public, and that it's not really there's not very strong evidence there. Like, that's very different from when we look at attitudinal polarization among political elites who serve in Congress, like while back in the days there were plenty of conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, we have really seen that that the representatives from the two parties have drifted so far away from each other that on an ideological scale, the most conservative Democrat is still way more liberal in their voting behavior than the most liberal Republican, and that used to be very different. So like the trends in attitudinal polarization are quite different for elites versus the mass public. We don't really have the same data on effective polarization because unfortunately we don't really get to ask people in Congress how much they dislike supporters of the other side. But yeah, like I thought that it's fascinating that the pattern of attitudinal polarization is so different between the mass public and elites.
Great point, Jan. And there are some significant headwinds if the exhausted Americans, if the middles really want to move away from polarization, there are some significant headwinds fighting against them for that. And some people in the chat have mentioned, and you all have too, the way that people speak about each other. I call this the sportification of politics. So now I'm on a team and you're on a team and I don't care what happens as long as we win. And that, from my vantage point as a journalist, I see happening on both sides, and you can make arguments about which is worse, and people will. But the sportification of politics is, I think, a very dangerous trend. And then the other that I wind up talking a lot about is the headwind of misinformation, which is both a symptom of polarization and a cause of polarization. And I know, Kristen, you had asked me to define, there are different kinds of misinformation, and I'll just do that quickly in case we need to talk about it more. But really, there are three kinds. I use misinformation as a general umbrella term, but misinformation is information that is just wrong, and it gets shared. And there are lots of studies out there that show how difficult it is to pull back misinformation once it is shared. And I'll talk about that in a second. But the other two kinds are disinformation and malinformation. So if misinformation is just wrong and it gets shared, disinformation is intentionally wrong, and it is trying to trick people. And malinformation may be true. There may be some grain of truth in it, or it may be completely true, but it is presented out of context or in a way intended to do harm. So misinformation, bad enough. Disinformation and malinformation, really, really rotten players to doing that. So that's something we can discuss too. But what I was alluding to is the studies are very, very clear that it is much harder to get out and undo misinformation of any stripe than it is to try to inoculate against it. And that's part of why CoLab here in Colorado is working so diligently to try to get that information out ahead of misinformation, to try to get the good information out ahead of the misinformation, so that people have an inoculation against that bad information, because the human brain is wired to remember what it hears first. And me repeating, oh, that's wrong, oftentimes the human brain will just hear that information again and not register the undoing of whatever that information was, which is a fascinating and horrifying aspect of fighting misinformation, and is contributing to the polarization, clearly.
For sure. I want to pick up on this, Laura, and bring in Jan and Stephen to comment on it, because there was a study I had read about, it's a couple years old now, that was talking a little bit about this idea of political hate, right? And that ideological hate of the other side, and those that have that greater sense of hate of that other political side had a stronger likelihood and willingness to share misinformation or fake news about that other party. And so, Laura mentioned the both cause and the effect, this feedback loop that happens, right? I'm curious, you all are both, you got sociology and psychology here, right? Can you all unpack that a little bit for me about that? What happens when we see this sort of really strong dichotomy happening, and how that kind of plays out to exacerbate this both misinformation, disinformation challenge that we have?
Yeah,
I don't know if start on that. Jan, please go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I think that the motivation to be a good partisan, I think over the last few decades, like partisanship has become a really strong identity. So people are not just like, they don't just vote, they also identify with their party, and they identify with disliking the other side, or at least many people do. So that provides a motivation that is another factor that adds to how we interpret incoming information, right? Like I think most people, or maybe almost all people, have a basic motivation to process information accurately, but we also have other motivations on top of that. And I think one motivation is to interpret incoming information through a partisan lens, so that it either like makes our own party look good or the other party look bad. And I think in that sense, polarization can be an antecedent of like how misinformation gets spread. But then like, if we get a lot of misinformation that like presents the other side in a bad light, then we're using that information ourselves, but like that can also contributing to making ourselves even more polarized, because now we think that our dislike is actually based in reality. It is based on these other people really being bad and evil people, right? So like, I think like that is like one way to think about how effective polarization can both cause like being susceptible to misinformation, but also be a consequence of receiving this information.
Totally agree. And I would add that, just coming back to the point I mentioned about the false polarization, or what we refer to as perception gaps, where there's what we expect the other side thinks and then what they actually think. We found that the people who were the most politically engaged, meaning they're the most active on social media in terms of sharing posts and writing about politics, they actually had the largest misperceptions about the other side, despite watching more news, being more engaged in politics, and having that as a bigger part of their life. And so it isn't necessarily the case that the most engaged are the most informed. It can be the case that the most engaged are actually have the biggest caricature of understanding about others. And it relates to a broader sociological reality of our country over the last generation or so of partisan sorting, where we find that people who move into certain urban areas, for instance, might be college educated and secular and Democrat and progressive. And whereas it used to be that in the middle of the 20th century, for instance, you had a lot of cross-cutting identities where Democrats and Republicans were very likely to be neighbors, or where you had Democrats and Republicans, but they both identified as Christian. We're seeing fewer and fewer of those overlapping central identities and more of this kind of stacking of identities. And what the relevance of that to the first point is that when you have less interaction between people who are different, in Palo Alto, it's hard to find a conservative, and in parts of Colorado Springs, it might be hard to find a progressive. And when that's your social reality, the everyday encounters that might contradict your caricatured understanding don't happen. And so you're allowed to live in your bubble, where everybody that you know reinforces your perspective and allows you to preserve your partisan lens on reality.
We also have
No
a
offense
media
to Palo
bubble.
Alto, by the way.
Yeah. We also have a media bubble too, don't we, Laura? Could you comment about that and the media landscape?
Yes, well, and it has long roots. I mean, so if you look back historically at media, it was not an interactive enterprise. It's been very much a one-way, kind of almost ivory tower. We are here, we're going to decide what's news, and we're going to spit it out to you, whether it's through print or airwaves or what have you. And media have recognized, real news media have recognized that this has been a problem. And so we're working to correct it. And that's why one of our 3 pillars is community engagement, trying to bring the public in. And it's a bit of a black box problem. It's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. Nobody tends to pull back the curtain and see how media is actually created. And so the same kinds of characterizations and misconceptions that happen between, the polarized sides happen with the media too. Well, we can assume that all media are liberal, or we can assume that people just make things, journalists just make things up because other people are making things up. And there's no real education on how the sausage is made. Nobody has a very good, generally, idea about the difference between a Fox News and an MSNBC, who are very much in the entertainment business and very less so in the news business. And the journalists who are out there doing original reporting that is fact-checked and adheres to some sort of ethics standards. And so it's a big problem to break media out of the bubble, open that up, make it more transparent, and let people participate in it in a way that we haven't done. So that's part of the work that is before us. One of the things, just share it, because I find it interesting, but one of the things that we're doing is creating something called Amplify Colorado, because we know there are certain communities who have been left out in a significant and harmful way, whether it's communities of color or rural communities, or just communities that for various reasons have been not an integral part, not covered well, not been able to participate or access quality news. And so Amplify Colorado is trying to break down some of those walls to reach out to, we're starting with communities of color and going from there to bring them into the process. What are their experiences and their expertise, so that journalists can connect with them, and also who are the journalists who are out there, so that people can connect with the journalists to humanize and make them available, so that they're not in a bubble.
Thank you.
We launch that next week, so stay tuned.
Okay, good. You queued us up to where I want
to. You heard it here first.
You heard it here first. I love it. I mean, some of this comes down to, Laura, some of the stuff we've talked about, which is how do you build meaningful relationships and trust, right? So that when this divisiveness happens, or when this othering happens, or when this disinformation happens, right? Like, there are go-to relationships to try to work to overcome it. So Laura, you cued us quite well, where I want to actually start talking about these things that actually work, right? These interventions, these things that actually, Jan, you can start for me, please, talking about the Strengthening Democracy Initiative, which is research-based proof of things that can be done to actually reduce some of this. Do you want to cue us up with a little bit of that? And if you want to share a little bit about why we need to do some research into what is effective from a methodological standpoint, so that we aren't just all out there, particularly those of us who are boundary spanners, right? We're like, oh, we think this is a good idea to work, but you've actually had this wonderful experiment that's been going on through many universities and partners that kind of talks about what Laura was doing. Could you cue us up? And I would love Stephen and Laura to also chime into this conversation. I'll step back.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. It's like when you do something in the real world without like trying to really disentangle what is driving effects, it's like oftentimes like very hard to say like what is really the ingredient of a certain intervention that leads to change, right? Like many people have like probably heard the saying, correlation isn't causation, right? Like just because like two things like coincide and like happen at the same time, we can't be sure like what is really causing what here. And so the scientific methodology that we are using in order to really identify what does a certain intervention do is called an experiment, which basically means that you are randomly assigning different groups of people to go through different processes. And because they're randomly assigned, you know that there will be like with a certain probability distribution that we don't have to get into, that like they will like show similar baseline levels without taking the intervention into account, right? So we have what is called a control group where people don't do an intervention, and that provides us with a baseline level of effective polarization, for example. And then in the other groups where people go through a certain procedure, what you can call an intervention, then we can afterwards compare, like this group scores a bit higher on effective polarization or a bit lower on effective polarization. And then we can calculate the probability that this is due to random chance. And if that probability is very low, we can have quite high confidence that this intervention is actually having an effect. And so that is what we did with 25 different interventions at the same time, which also provides us insights into not only which of these interventions have effects, but also which of these interventions have the strongest effects. And that was really a new contribution that we made to this literature, which typically only identifies the effect of one intervention at a time. And so what we found when it comes to effective polarization, the intervention that produced the strongest effects were ones that were highlighting that they're sympathetic exemplars of people with different ideological beliefs. So I can give you a quick overview of one of the most promising intervention here, which was actually a video which served as an ad for the beer company Heineken, where they brought together people with very different ideological beliefs, and they met each other and then like followed a common task, which was to like build a bar, and after they built that bar, they were confronted with their different ideological beliefs, and then had the choice to either walk away or to share a beer with each other and discussing their differences. And that's what all of the pairs of people in that video did. And that video really like brought across that people can reasonably disagree on important political issues, but there can still be an appreciation. And these people were all sympathetic, relatable people. So and like that relates to a big stream in the literature of like bringing people in contact with people of the other side. And if those conversations or contexts are positive experiences, that really has a lot of potential for reducing effective polarization.
So Jan, are you saying beer is the answer?
That is like, like that's where conclusions can get
That's where we're going.
Like
that's where we're going. It's not a bad place.
Yeah, like we actually like.
So interestingly,
Please go ahead.
Beer is also the problem, Laura, because we have spoken to the Heineken team and the Bud Light controversy around the transgender figure that Dylan Mullaney, that they had sort of sponsoring their beer, spooked them, and they weren't sure what to do moving ahead in the United States with their work. But I want to just share one experience More in Common had. We were inspired by the Democracy Challenge, Stanford's Strength of Democracy Challenge, and tried to deploy some of their most effective methods together. And we also used a randomized control trial. So we had a control group, and then we had 3 treatment groups. And so we were able to sort of isolate the effects of different interventions. And what we found was using the sympathetic outgroup member was really powerful. So we had video footage of people who were Democrats if the viewer was Republican, or were Republicans if the viewer was a Democrat. But what was really crucial, and this was also true in the Heineken ad, is you need to have somebody who is also taking the journey of persuasion with you. And so we started off the video with Democrats, for instance, saying, I don't think Republicans have anything in common with me. Then they would watch these videos of sympathetic Republicans who would express viewpoints that are quite common among Republicans. And we would include statistics that showed that the viewpoints expressed in the video are actually very common. Let me just give one example. We asked Democrats, what percent of Republicans do you think believe that we should teach Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks in schools for students to learn about American history, learn about their role in American history? And Democrats thought only 35% of Republicans would want to teach MLK and Rosa Parks. And the actual figure is 93%. And so there's this big gap. And so we integrated those statistics. We featured outgroup members who were sympathetic, and we showed members of your own team going on this journey of persuasion. And we saw really big effects to this from this video, where people went from their place of animosity back to that level of near neutrality that Jan and I were talking about before. So that was very exciting for us. But there's bad news. Jan, I don't know if you want to break it to them, but the bad news is that we know that in this media environment that we're in, people are just under a waterfall of information all the time. And you're on your phone 8 hours a day, and then on TV and on your computer, et cetera. And what we're doing with these experiments is effective, but it's very quickly depleted and undermined by the other avalanche of information, and I'm mixing metaphors, of information that contradicts it. And so we found that within 1 week, that neutrality feeling was eroded and people were back to their prior position. And so what that means to us is that in terms of interventions that will be effective, we really need an engine of this content, or a change in our culture, really, where people would be encountering members of the other party in a way that disabuses them of their misconceptions of other people, reduces their fear, and that allows people to have a clearer picture of reality. And that needs to be constantly reinforced. And so we really have a work ahead of us, because we kind of know what fires the piston, but we need to now figure out how to build the rest of the engine and put it into a car so that it can actually take us into the future we want to build.
That's fascinating. So I'm sorry, Kristen, I just want to follow up. My brain is now churning on, well, what role could a responsible media play in that kind of world that you're describing, for that constant feeding of legitimate, contextualized information?
Laura, that is where I'm wanting to go, actually. So maybe we'll cue up there, which is, I want to pull some of these threads you all have here, keeping an eye on our time, which is, there are roles for major actors here, right? There are always some bad actors, no matter where they are. We're up against algorithms. We're up against our own human nature, right? Of how our psychology works and what feeds into us and gets us looped into these things. We're up against incentives that you alluded to earlier, Stephen, and just kind of how our political structure, particularly in the US, is set up from a win and lose perspective, to the horse racing, Laura, that I know you talk about. So let's talk about some of these big actors and framing, and what we think their roles are or should be, and where we think we're going to have some big impact. Because Stephen, you just alluded to it, and the media is a big piece of this. But there are a lot of organizations, actors in this space, because a lot of this comes down, I think, to what we want to talk about too, which is the individual level, right? And the individual is extremely important to this. And we know an individual collective is really hard to sometimes move the needle on, in addition to kind of big organizational actors. So that was a big sort of squishy question, but I want us to all, maybe the three of you, just to kind of reflect and comment on some of that framing. Laura, maybe I'll start with you if you want to start with thinking about the media a little bit, and then we can go.
Well, I'll share with our audience here some of the things that we're doing. One thing that I think is relevant and they may be interested in, CoLab is right now helping to train a dozen news organizations across Colorado in something called engaged elections. And the idea is that the questions and the coverage do not come internally from the media organization, they come from the public. So one of the approaches, for example, would be kind of turning the idea of a oh shoot, I've gone blank on what they're called. When you have a person who's running for office, a politician come, shoot, sorry, I've gone blank. When you have a politician come and talk to people in the public.
Speech.
No, not a stump speech, is a formal, oh my gosh, sorry. But it doesn't matter what it's called. The idea is that it gets turned on its head so that the public is actually asking the politician the questions instead of the politician driving the meeting. So
our audience
town hall, thank you, town hall, thank you. Yes, exactly.
Ding, ding,
oh my
ding.
gosh. Yeah. So, and this is part of the problem. We're all exhausted. All journalists are exhausted. So it turns the town hall on its head. And we are helping to train through working with an organization called Hearken. And the idea is that these dozen news organizations that will then be able to help the other, 178 news organizations in CoLab learn how to do this. And the one thing that I think you'll find very interesting is that we have specifically asked these news organizations to not do one kind of story. There's lots of kinds of political coverage. There is one kind of story that we have specifically asked them to not ever do. And that is the horse race coverage, because we know that that does harm. And so let me just define horse race coverage. It's nothing about the person. It's nothing about the policies. It is all about who is ahead of whom in a poll or in fundraising or whatever it is, which is, exactly the wrong kind of, it reinforces that sportification. It's a horse race. Which horse am I going to bet on? I sure hope that other horse doesn't get ahead of my horse. So we have asked them not to do that and are helping them try to figure out how to do these reverse town halls and other approaches to bring, we're putting widgets on their social media and their websites that allow the public to ask questions so that then journalists can go out and get answers to those questions, finding out what people really actually care about. And what we expect to find in line with the research that Jan and Stephen have been talking about is that a lot of people, no matter where they fall politically, have the same kinds of questions. They care about largely the same kinds of issues. So we hope to tap that middle, that group of people we were talking about, and give them some engagement that is positive engagement, not the kind of engagement that makes you want to throw things at the TV.
Jan, do you want to chime in with some actors and what we think we should be doing with them?
Yeah, totally. So my thinking is very similar, especially to what Stephen had described earlier. So I think identifying these psychological mechanism in terms of if something gets triggered, what are the responses to that in individuals? It's absolutely crucial to understand that. But if we're thinking about making changes at the societal level, right, then we really need to talk about events that can trigger these changes in entire groups of people, right? Whether that be local events or even national events. And I think for that, the role of organizations and of elites are so extremely crucial. And we really see that elites in particular can cause polarization and can reduce polarization. An ad of Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah, and his opponent in the 2020 election, where they jointly endorse a peaceful transition of power independent of the election results in Utah was one of the interventions in our tournament, and actually like reduced effective polarization, strengthened democratic attitudes, so elites can really have very powerful effects. But we also see that the opposite is true too, right? When like elites are engaging in fear mongering and like describing the other side as extreme, that can create the very issue of effective polarization that we're seeing here, because they can trigger these psychological mechanisms in so many people at the same time because they are so widely heard. And similar with organizations, you know, I mean, social media organizations are certainly not the only types of actors in this space, but the way that they design their algorithms in terms of what kind of posts, what kind of information you see has a big impact, right? And I think that there are like different ways to design such such algorithms. Like, for example, you can try to maximize attention, right, or clicks, and so on. And I think that can sometimes result in people associating way more extreme opinions with a typical supporter of the other side. But if we can change those algorithms and like build in a wake for like the kind of extremity of views, like or you know, the kind of polarization that is indicative of a post into the kind of algorithm that decides which posts are seen more or less often. I also think that that would have a huge impact in terms of on the kind of content that a lot of different people would see and the kind of psychological mechanisms that would then be triggered by these kind of polls. So I think it's really an interplay of elites, organizations, and the individuals for creating change.
I would agree with that. I think I want to talk about two domains that I think are really important here. One is organizations that can convene communities. There's a really strong relationship between loneliness and ideological polarization, where people who are isolated find community in a space where people have a common set of beliefs and where there's a very clear outgroup. And that can be that you're part of Antifa, or it can be that you're part of MAGA. But there's a decline generally in America, but especially among younger people, in not having friends and not having a social life. And the absence of community allows people to find ideological cohorts that they then belong to. And it's generally bad for many reasons, but it is one of the exacerbating factors of polarization. And as I mentioned before, the lack of interaction directly with and having relationships with people of different viewpoints means you are left with your imagination and with your distorted viewpoint from social media and traditional media that's playing into a stereotyped view of the other side. So building community is one mechanism that society should be looking to invest in for many reasons, and a downstream effect of it would be reduction of polarization. The second is much broader, I think, and that is one feature of polarization that Jan kind of alluded to before, but we didn't specify very much, is that Republicans and Democrats used to have roughly the same number of people who identified as liberal and conservative within them among the voters. And now we've seen in the last 15 years, the Republican Party really has pulled away the conservative voters, and Democrats have become more liberal. And what's happened concurrently with that is our culture-making institutions, Hollywood, magazines and newspapers, and also our universities, have taken on a more narrow ideological or more liberal viewpoint in a way that doesn't reflect the breadth of the country. It represents a partisan or an ideological viewpoint that has now caused a backlash among conservatives. And conservatives talk about this in a particular way. They say that politics is downstream of culture. And what that means is our kids are living on TikTok, not living on C-SPAN. And so they're overwhelmingly consuming music and entertainment, and their heroes are people in the entertainment world who are shaping their values. And now what we're seeing is conservative groups like Daily Wire are creating and PragerU are creating alternative entertainment to try and pull their kids out of mainstream entertainment, which is endorsing only one set of values in their perspective. And so part of what I think would be very healthy for America is to have more viewpoint diversity within our culture making institutions, partly because they're losing credibility. The universities in the United States used to have pretty strong credibility across partisan groups, and we're seeing that decline year after year as conservatives are becoming more and more suspicious of university settings. And so these places that create what the American values are and are on Hollywood and in music are venues where this debate also needs to come in, and where we need not to change the values, but probably to broaden the values. Diversity and equity inclusion are crucial. But if your focus is only on those things and you don't talk about more conservative values like patriotism, like commitment to family, like work ethic, and you're only focused on those things, you're going to continue to see this backlash, which is the thing that the Republican Party is effectively running on now, is it's running against a cultural movement of wokeism much more than it is running on fiscal conservatism and reducing the budget. And so what we're seeing is a political response to a cultural change. And if we can intervene in the culture, then we might see politics respond in a positive way.
That was great. I want to give you all just a couple minutes here to close this out with some kind of final thoughts here. Thank you all, first of all, for today. But what are some recommendations you have for people to take away from here today? Right? I obviously, just so our audience knows, there's a great number of reports and resources we're going to send your way. But I'd be curious if you all have a couple, handful, whatever it is that you want to share. That's a takeaway that you want the audience to really think about, whether it's a new way of thinking or whether it's something they could or should be doing.
I'll jump in, and it builds on what I have been saying, for the public to be involved in the production of our news media, to have a more significant role, more input, more access, and more consumption of that, for all the reasons that Jan and Stephen have so eloquently laid out. So I'm hoping that this is a bit of an inspirational push for folks. I suspect the 100+ people who are on this call are relatively engaged already, but maybe getting your friends, neighbors, children, grandchildren involved as well to demand higher quality and the change in culture that Stephen, I wrote it down. I'm going to follow up on that. That's really an important point. Thank you.
I'll be really brief. I think in addition to what Laura said about mis and disinformation, part of the challenge is that news media are just affirming a perspective that they've already defined as being important and embodying the values that they want. And so if you can moderate your diet, meaning have a more diverse set of news sources in what you consume, you're going to pick up on stories that may not necessarily contradict what you're reading, but complicate it, and that help you to understand and empathize with the perspective that you disagree with the most. And that's so much of what I think I try to do. There are news websites like Both Sides that compile perspectives from the left and the right to help you to see an issue as it's being discussed from the left and the right, and not just within your one echo chamber. So that would be my one recommendation, is to try and add diversity to your news diet.
Yeah, so like I like sometimes when we give these talks, like we get the question like, is effective polarization really bad, or like doesn't it make sense to like dislike supporters who hold very different beliefs? And I think the two ways where like I think like everyone is making their own decision, but I think two ways in which this can be really influential is like one, in personal relationships that we very much care about ourselves. Like like my grandma is a very important person in my life, and we sometimes hold somewhat different ideological beliefs, but it's very important for me to maintain that relationship in my life and not let that be effective, or like let my own beliefs about my grandma be very much affected by that. And then the other point is that I think sometimes the kind of decisions that we're making that can be driven by our dislike for the other side when it gets really extreme will impact not only our own lives, but also the lives of future generations. I think it's very important that we leave future generations with a well-functioning democracy. And if that sometimes means to like not get my own preferred candidate, but get a candidate that respects democratic principles, then I think that is worth a trade-off. And I think like we need to bring ourselves in a position where we would still make that decision and not being so overwhelmed by dislike for our political opponents.
Well said. I saw an amen coming from Laura, from Stephen on that. I'm going to add in this thought because it ties into what you all say, which is I'm going to offer that we all need to learn to disagree better, right? A couple of you all mentioned Governor Cox. There's a fascinating tour that him and Governor Polis are doing, which is showing how you can sit down and you actually can disagree about issues without really being damaging in the rhetoric of how you talk about the other. Whether we do this at our kitchen table over the family Thanksgiving, whether we do that with our partner at home, you know, learning to be able to disagree, have hard conversations is really critical, I think, to this conversation, and something we all can do at the individual level. Thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. I could spend hours talking with you all. I'm sure our guests could as well. Just really grateful to Laura, Jan, and Stephen for obviously the work that you all are doing individually, but for joining us today. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all. Thanks to our audience for joining us. We'll be following up with the video link recording if you'd like to share this with someone, as well as some resources for you all to read a little bit more. And we'll keep you posted on our next episode sometime here in the future. Everyone take care and happy disagreeing.